Good evening, everybody. We are here with another presentation of the GOSA presentation series for 2025. We are here tonight with Tara Cross about the Fountain Geyser stall mode, a history and what to watch for as well. And I have to say that is always one of my favorite photos of Fountain with the sunset right there. That one is always one of my favorites there, Tara. And with that, I will get right to Tara here.
Will's interrupting me.
Yep. The computers are deciding to computers, so just give me one moment here. Just decided to kick out one of my settings and make a black screen here. So just one moment. Again. Okay, we're all set for you, Tara.
Good evening. Welcome to this presentation, part of the OSA Winter Presentation Series. I want to thank Will Bokel for getting this set up and taking care of all the technical issues once again, and of course, GOSA for hosting the series. I've been enjoying everybody else's series this year. They're in presentations, and I want to thank some individuals who were very helpful for this program for me. Graham Meach, above all, helping me understand what was going on with fountain stalls when I couldn't be there. Lynn Stevens, and of course, all of the contributors to Geyser Times, uh, which I relied on very heavily to put this together. Um, so my name is Tara Cross. I have been geyser gazing since 1988. I have been working 9 out of the last 10 seasons in Yellowstone with the ability to go see Fountain quite a lot throughout the season. And I've seen many of these stall behaviors that I'm going to be talking about, but I've also relied on other people, the conversations that we have. So again, thanks to everybody for the information. Fountain, of course, is my favorite geyser that erupts every day, and nobody's here in the room to throw things at me, so I can say that. Um, that's back at you, Corbin. But the topic of fountain stalls is actually quite a big one. So while I say it's Fountain Geyser stall mode, history, and what to watch for, I want to treat this more like an FAQ because there is a lot that you can talk about. There are a lot of little details, um, and stalls are weird. They are difficult to interpret. And overall, when you walk up and you see what is on the screen here, your heart probably sinks because you came out when you thought fountain should be due to erupt, and instead it's up to some foolery with these high water levels in Fountain and Morning and crazy things happening with clepsydra. So my goal for this presentation is to explain the behaviors you are likely to see, with the caveat that almost any rule has an exception or two, and things also change over time. I will not be dealing with a lot of charts. In fact, I will have no charts and statistics because the data is too incomplete. We don't have monitoring that's capable of even figuring out how many stall intervals there are, let alone what's happening in the group when they happen. So this is based on visual observations only, and also the ones that were put into geyser times. So It's, I think, very safe to generalize about what goes on in fountain stalls, but I can't give really solid numbers about how often, what percentage of eruptions do this behavior or that behavior. So that will not be the focus of this presentation. And I hope in that light that what I share here will help people to realize what's going on, what they're seeing, not turn around and leave, or maybe they will turn around and leave. They'll realize that it's going to be a long time before Fountain goes. But either way, put more of that information into geyser time so we get a more complete picture of what is happening when that happens. So I'll start here with a mea culpa, because I started calling this behavior with the high water levels in Fountain and usually a long interval of Fountain, a fountain stall in 2017. And in 2017, the most recent edition of the Geysers of Yellowstone was the fourth edition. And on page 224 of the fourth edition is this quote from T. Scott Bryan. On a few occasions during those years, which would be the early 90s that he was talking about, there were fountain stalls in which Fountain Geyser had extraordinarily long intervals and the water level rose in morning. The effect was that the system was trying to shift energy to morning, but it might have been years before it finally did so had it not been for an earthquake in early 1994. So the information that this term had already been used was available to me. I just failed to notice it. So I do apologize. It might be better to call it something more appropriate to the behavior as well. Besides the fact that I reuse the term, because fountain stalls are actually more the story of clepsydra. And clepsydra extended pause mode is what Lynn Stevens calls it, and I agree it is a more accurate term, although sometimes you can get these behaviors without clepsydra technically pausing, but still, it's all part of the same thing, and it has to do with clepsydra far more than it has to do with fountain. But in my defense, there's a reason that we fixate on fountain. You can see here on this map, it is the centerpiece of the group that bears its name. And we have been very spoiled in the last few decades to have it as a daily geyser. That has not always been the case. It has had dormancies of years when sometimes there was even bacteria growing in it. The only dormancies that we have seen recently were either when morning was active in 1991, and you'll take that trade, or when Fountain was having its own wild phase behavior. That happened a few times in the early 2000s. Fountain wouldn't erupt for maybe 1 to 2 weeks during that time of the wild phase. And just a quick descriptor of the wild phase in case it ever happens again at Fountain. The vent on the right-hand side as you're standing on the boardwalk is erupting constantly to like 6 to 10 feet. And meanwhile, the pool level is very high. So the neat thing about it is you get to see that beautiful blue pool. But of course, that's the only neat thing, because Fountain is not erupting when that wild phase behavior is happening. On this map, I have labeled the other geysers that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. You'll notice as you look at clepsydra over on the left, that the side vent is not in this image, the side vent that we are familiar with now. I'll talk about that in a moment. This image is from 2015, so that's before it broke out. But first, I want to talk about the history of clepsydra wild phases, because if you listen to tour guides coming through the Fountain area, you'll hear a story about clepsydra that says that it was erupting like clockwork every 3 minutes right up until the Hebgen Lake earthquake in August of 1959. And at that point, it went into wild phase, and that is what we have seen ever since. The second part of that is true. The first part of it is not. Clepsydra went through various changes before the 59 earthquake. The wild phase of activity of clepsydra was actually first seen in 1941. Then later in the 40s and going into the 50s, an interesting pattern developed where morning would erupt and then clepsydra would follow about 3 hours later with a wild phase eruption that lasted several hours. And then there would be a break, and then Fountain would follow clepsydra. And so George Marler called this the chain of geysers activity. And so there were days that passed between eruptions of morning, but this whole sequence, a morning eruption, a clepsydra eruption, and then a Fountain eruption, and maybe 2 or 3 Fountain eruptions, and then a period of quiet would occur. But that did all change at the time of the 1959 Hebgen Lake earthquake. Just following it, Fountain was erupting, morning was erupting, clepsydra was erupting, and that was the first known concerted eruption of Fountain and morning at that time. Morning continued to erupt for a long time after Fountain quit, and then clepsydra was in wild phase and continued to erupt after morning quit, and it was the only one of those changes that happened in the Fountain group to persist for a long time after the 59 earthquake. And that's been what we know of clepsydra. Fountain will have an eruption, clepsydra will pause 1 to 4 times after Fountain, and then it will resume the wild phase activity until after the next Fountain. Actually, I said 1 to 4 times. It doesn't necessarily always pause. I think Lynn said something about 5% of eruptions don't have any pause at all. So that's the behavior that we are used to seeing. And so here, this photo I took in 2009, and it is missing the side vent, which is located over to the right of clepsydra. And its breakout occurred after the fountain stall behavior started. It happened in early 2017. So you can see the first breakout was observed on May 17. The photo on the left shows kind of a hissing steam vent that was coming through a crack. This new opening to the right of clepsydra. Over the days, it became more and more that there was water coming out of that opening. So by May 27, you can see more of a steady column with angled jetting. And then during during clepsydra's pauses, there was a lot of churning going on, and eventually it broke out what we see today, which is this broad vent that has been eroded out with a lot of debris thrown around the edges of the crater. So this was June 3rd that it kind of started having this bursting behavior. It did widen after that some, but basically this is the form that we know it. And Clepsydra's side vent receives overflow from fountain eruptions and will stay up a little bit after and then drop. It's a helpful gauge of recent fountain eruptions, but that changes by season. So sometimes the water level is too low to be helpful, to be visible from the boardwalk. The water level was high enough for bursting to be visible from it from 2021 to 2023. In 2024, the water level dropped, and so it was unusual to see water bursting above the rim. I'm told that as of February 2025, the water level had come back up again. So that is all the background on Clepsydra. So what happens when there is an extended pause mode? It was first seen in November 2015, next seen in October 2016, and then became quite common in 2017, sometimes occurring every 1 to 4 days. There were few, if any, stalls seen in 2018 and 2019 when morning was active, and it was also uncommon in 2020. But I will point out that during those years, there was a lot of competing interest from Steamboat and Giant, and so there are less observations to go from. But this extended pause mode or fountain stalls have been more common since 2021, with new variations introduced each season. But the basics are that Clepsydra starts pausing after an eruption of fountain, and instead of stopping, which it should have said 0 to 4, but I have 1 to 4 pauses here, it continues pausing for a period of 1 to 8 hours. There may be as few as 9 pauses and as many as 30 or 50 or even 60 pauses. Once Clepsydra finally comes back on steady, some hours will then elapse before fountain finally erupts. So, just to make things fun, of course, there are some variations on this pause mode. The most typical behavior is long pause mode, with Clepsydra eruptions lasting 2 to 10 minutes and pauses lasting 3 to 10 minutes. Clepsydra may do this for a couple of hours. It may transition into shorter pauses or sloppy play without distinct stops and starts for a period of time, and then transition back into more distinct pauses. Or it may continue on with the long pauses for the entire duration of the pause mode. There may also be a stall when most of Clepsydra's pauses are sloppy and indistinct. And then, just for fun, just so we can't really call it Clepsydra pause mode, we have to have an exception. Seen only during July through September of 2022, a front vent stall, which occurs when Clepsydra never fully shuts off, but rather the front pool vent stops bursting, and only the top vertical vent and the left side angled vent erupt weekly. So it's kind of a weird look to it. It's the whole of Clepsydra's system is on weekly. There is water in that front pool, but it's not stopping and starting as it would be during the regular pause mode. This seems to have the same effect as pause mode, however, with water levels rising in the rest of the group following the previous eruption of fountain. So this Clepsydra pause mode, or the fountain stall intervals, may have several possible outcomes. Most typically, Clepsydra will eventually come on strong and steady, and fountain will erupt 1 to 4 hours after that. This time seems to scale with whatever fountain's normal intervals have been. So if fountains intervals have been short, like they were in 2017, it might be 1 to 3 hours. Or if they've been running longer, like they were in 2024, it ranged from 4 to 6 hours. And that was the longest time from when Clepsydra came on steady until Fountain's eruption that we had seen so far. The fountain intervals are lengthened roughly, but not directly, in proportion with the length of the Clepsydra pause mode, and have ranged from 6 to 12 hours, with most typically falling between 7.5 and 10 hours. First seen in 2020, a less common outcome is for fountain to start erupting before Clepsydra comes on steady. These have been called short or aborted stalls. A larger proportion of stall intervals were this type in 2021 compared to other years. Since then, they have been seen only a few times each season. So, moving on to the other geysers in the group, water levels are going to be coming up during this Clepsydra pause mode. So this is Spasm Geyser. It's right in front of Clepsydra. And what this photo is showing is a normal start for Spasm, which comes up from a low water level, or actually an empty crater with a low water level, and then rises, comes to overflow, and subsides into a steady roil with bursting. That's a normal eruption of Spasm. But in the stall behavior, the crater gradually fills uh, with a calm pool, very quiet, very placid, very um, in the regular behavior. There's enough churning to stir up some muddy water in Spasm. The water is totally clear when it's coming up during a stall. So instead of dropping back down when Clepsydra comes on steady, the water is rising in Spasm. The process continues. It kind of goes up and down with each Clepsydra pause until it reaches the overflow point. It builds to a steady boil, and then larger bursting will follow that. And then that will continue for many hours, and it will be heavily overflowing and bursting for 4, 5, 6 hours during the stall behavior. The intervals and durations during regular cycle will vary quite a bit from season to season. Last year, 2024, they were pretty short, 1.5 to 3.5 hours, and durations of 24 to 45 minutes. Sometimes there'll be a longer cycle where the regular durations will be 80 to 90 minutes, but these ones during the stalls will be many hours, much longer, most of the time. Occasionally, it might be shorter than that, but most of the time, they're going to be very long. And along with Spasm coming up, Fountain will also come up. So I these arrows are actually kind of enormous, but I hope everyone can see this illustration pretty well. This shows uh, the typical pre-eruptive water level during a normal fountain interval during 2024. And so these are some of the markers that I use to gauge the water level in fountain. So this rectangle, that is a really good gauge for a normal interval, but it's no good for stalls because in a stall, the water will be covering that rectangle. Next up, you have the rocks, and the water will move its way up the rocks and then cover them. And then next, you're dealing with the neck. The water will start moving its way out that back notch in Fountain's crater. And then finally, the oval, which is that scab on the back of the crater. Kind of hard to see in certain lighting for sure. But when you're talking about water levels in terms of the oval, you are definitely talking about a stall water level. And so during the clepsydra pause mode, fountain's water level continues to rise over a period of hours. And the more hours that pass, the more clepsydra pause behavior continues, the higher that water level will get. Um, this is showing the rocks in a normal interval as well. So just to go back, you've got normal interval with the rectangle, normal interval with the rocks, and then we start looking at these stall water levels. So if you could see over there on the left, that oval is partially underwater. And that will occur some hours after the clepsydra pause mode has started. Then, in a typical situation where the interval is very long, somewhere in the order of 7 to 10 or even 12 hours, you have clepsydra will come back on steady after being in the pause mode. And as it comes back on steady, the water level in fountain will begin to drop. So Graham was kind enough to share with me some photos of various water levels as fountain's water level dropped back down. And this period of time after clepsydra comes on steady will last a few hours, but usually the dropping will occur within the first 90 minutes or so of that time frame. There's another one just at the bottom of the oval. Another one, the oval is not covered at all, but you also can't see the rocks. So there's a water level high enough to cover the rocks still, but doesn't quite get up to the oval. And then here, even lower, but still not revealing any rocks. And I wish I had a good picture of kind of the final part of this sequence, which would show just a little island of rock, just a tiny little bit of an island of those rocks showing. That would still be a water level that probably resulted from a stall. So, of course, there has to be an exception, which is that the water level can rise up like it was in that first stall photo, and then fountain can start without clepsydra ever coming on steady. So it starts from a very high water level because it hasn't had a chance to drop after clepsydra came back on. Morning's Thief may stay at a high water level and continue to boil through most of fountain's eruption in the case of an aborted stall. Water levels remain high in fountain and spasm and jelly instead of draining after fountain is over. And so this aborted stall, you go through that sequence of clepsydra being in pause mode, and instead of clepsydra coming back on steady, fountain erupts instead. And that means that your intervals are going to be closer to normal, maybe a little on the longer side of normal when an aborted stall occurs than they would be if clepsydra came on steady and you needed that period of time, which may usually ranges from 2 to 4 hours, sometimes longer, for clepsydra to be on steady before fountain erupts. So another interesting thing to know about aborted stalls, and really important thing to point out for this presentation, because it can be one of the more confusing aspects of this behavior, is that when fountain erupts, before clepsydra had a chance to come on steady, the interval after the water level is influenced by that behavior. So the water levels remain high after the eruption is over and then stay high in fountain. And fountain will usually have maybe a few of the rocks exposed. It's going to look, you're going to walk up and you're going to think, that looks like a stall water level to me, maybe not quite high enough. So a few rocks might be showing. That means, well, I say this as if it's really easy to tell. It isn't. I've been fooled before. But it's a good thing to remember that you can have a normal interval after an aborted stall where fountain's water level is high. And that's one of the few circumstances where you'll see that high water level without the clepsydra pause mode having occurred. There are a few situations here and there, just oddball cases where you get a really high water level in fountain without a stall and not probably not covering the rocks, but high enough to make you wonder whether there was a stall. But typically, if you do see that water level, it will be because there was a stall or an aborted stall. So moving on to jelly. It has been historically rare to see eruptions from jelly. This was taken in 2015. You can see that it's coming from a lower water level. The water is kind of murky. And if you look along that downhill edge, there's all broken center there. It hasn't been washed clean. It hasn't overflowed anytime recently. The timing of these eruptions would be during the first 10 minutes or so of a regular fountain eruption. So every few weeks, maybe during 2015 and 2016, we might catch jelly. Although I have to say, I probably missed a few eruptions because my back was turned looking at Morning's Thief. During stalls, increasingly, jelly got filled with overflow from spasm. So spasm would have these very long, hours long eruptions with heavy overflow. Jelly would fill up and start overflowing down the hillside. But it would also have its own convection. So on top of receiving a lot of overflow from spasm, jelly would come up and be pushing out hot water of its own. The question is, was the change in jelly because it started taking in overflow from spasm, or were they both affected by something underground? It's impossible to know for sure. Interesting to think about. So another chain reaction that happened with this. Oh, I'm so sorry. Here is a video of jelly that I meant to show you. So with all that overflow coming out of both spasm and jelly and going downhill, this runoff channel that you can see on the lower right is pouring into a not well-known feature. What I've got circled here is called Old Bellefontaine. And Old Bellefontaine has very rarely erupted. And if we're going to use Micah's geyser paleontology techniques, it is hard to see because it's so far from the boardwalk. But if you look carefully, you can see this white center edge. And that's that scalloped rim that Micah was talking about that would indicate a quiet pool and a static water level over a period of years, like you see at Blackpool at West Thumb or Heart Spring on Geyser Hill. So this photo shows that there was overflow, but it had dropped right below. You can see the bacteria kind of drying up in the runoff channel going out the backside. I started to see water level drop in Old Bellefontaine in 2022. I noted it up and down at various times in 2022 and 2023, but in 2024 it had drained completely. and I did not ever see a water level in Old Bellefontaine in 2024. So it's kind of down there. Below Jelly, there's Frolic Geyser erupting for reference. So when does Jelly erupt? It was first seen during long pause mode stalls in September 2022. So that was the first eruption since 2016. And it continued erupting under similar circumstances in 2023 and 2024. Jelly can erupt irrespective of the outcome of the stall. Clepsydra could continue pausing, it could go steady, or it could be interrupted by fountain in an aborted stall. Jelly will erupt from a full convecting pool. Bubbles begin to appear on the left side of the pool about 90 minutes to 2 hours before jelly erupts, leading to periodic episodes of heavier boiling. Now, I have watched this behavior occur and jelly did not erupt, so it's not 100% that if you see the bubbling along the left side of jelly's crater that you will get jelly, but that is a prerequisite for jelly to erupt. The eruptions themselves, as you saw in the video, consist of upwelling, thumps, a bouncing pool, and quick bursts that may reach 4 to 10 feet high. And I'll also point out that video is one of the stronger eruptions that I've seen. Sometimes you might get only one really good burst, or maybe two, in an eruption of jelly. And jelly has been known to erupt in series, often of 2 or 3 eruptions, while clepsydra is pausing, but as many as 7 have been seen, with intervals ranging from 27 to 44 minutes. Moving on to some of the other geysers in the group that have less to do with the stall behavior. They're more reactive than proactive during stalls. Jet geyser usually erupts in series with intervals in the 6 to 12-minute range. And the series may last a period of hours, and they will typically end either with an eruption of super frying pan or an eruption of fountain. If jet is active during fountain, intervals shorten to 1 to 3 minutes. If it is not active when fountain starts, a new series may start near the end of fountain. During stall behavior, jet will have a period of grumbling. This may take a long time. It may be several hours where it's just kind of all it's doing is grumbling, or maybe doing a few little very, very weak minor eruptions. It takes longer to get a series started during a stall, and it'll usually have several weak eruptions first before stabilizing to having a normal strength eruption and normal intervals of, again, 6 to 12 minutes. And usually jet has to recover and be erupting for at least 90 minutes before fountain has a chance to erupt during a stall, but not always. There isn't much difference between super frying pans intervals in a stall versus not in a stall, but the main difference is that the water level also comes up in super frying pan along with the rest of the group. So you will see standing water in super frying pan if there has been a stall. And then from that standing water, it may come up and erupt and then put out a lot of overflow and have a very strong eruption during a stall. And then twig, it is most typically seen to start late in a normal fountain eruption. During stalls, twig may have multiple eruptions before fountain erupts. But I was not able to find enough data to find a consistent pattern of what twig did during stalls. And then last but not least, morning's thief. So you'd think that with how closely related Morning's Thief has been to Fountain that it would have some sort of crazy change with the stall. But really, the main thing that we see is that its water level comes up along with Fountain and Morning during a stall. And it may have an eruption or two before Fountain, and then 1 to 3 eruptions during Fountain, just as it would with a regular eruption. One thing that can happen during a stall that doesn't happen at other times is that if Clepsydra is pausing for many, many hours, like 6 or more hours, Morning Thief may have an independent series, uh, either leading to Clepsydra turning steady or directly to an aborted stall. So there were 2 examples of that in 2023. On July 10, 2023, the independent series of Morning Thief led to Clepsydra coming on steady. So then there was a break. And then when Fountain finally did erupt, there were more eruptions of Morning Thief. On October 5, 2023, it was an aborted stall. So the series of Morning Thief eruptions led directly into the eruption of Fountain, and then several more Morning Thief eruptions after the start of Fountain. So this picture shows the water level of Morning Thief as the water level has come up in both Fountain and Morning. So you can see it's quite high, but not overflowing. It will sometimes boil as it gets deeper and deeper into the stall or closer to the eruption of Fountain. This photo shows Morning Thief high later in an eruption of Fountain. This is when there is an aborted stall. So Morning Thief had eruptions earlier in the Fountain eruption, and then it stayed high with boiling during the rest of Fountain's eruption. So it does react to stalls, but does not take a proactive role. What about Morning? This is my biggest FAQ question. If we've got high water levels in Morning and long intervals of Fountain, surely that means that that's a good thing for Morning. Well, unfortunately, I don't think it's good for Morning. I haven't seen any evidence that leads me to believe that Fountain stalls and Morning eruptions are very compatible. So since 2012, when you get Morning, you usually want a long duration of Fountain. You'll want it to last 33 to 44 minutes for there to be a chance for Morning. And the typical Fountain durations when you're having stalls are more like 25 to 31 minutes. So that's not long enough to get you a chance at an eruption of Morning. There's also no obvious relationship between the duration of Fountain and the incidence of a stall on a subsequent interval. In fact, there's really no way to know there's going to be a stall on the subsequent interval. You have to just stay after Fountain and see if the pauses are stopping and Clepsydra comes back on strong after 0 to 4 pauses, or if it continues on 5, 6, 7, and however many more pauses into a stall. That's the only way to tell. Water levels in Fountain and Morning during stalls are too high when compared to water levels that resulted in any type of Morning, whether it was a solo, dual, or trifecta. And then also, when the interval gets very, very long, that means that Clepsydra has come back on steady, and the water levels in Fountain and Morning actually drop at that time. Morning Thief water levels will be high with a Fountain stall, and I have never known for that to be good for Morning. I have a lot of data points saying that morning erupted with no water seen from Morning Thief, and I have no data points saying that water was seen in Morning Thief before morning started. Of course, we have the situation of a trifecta when Morning Thief does erupt along with Morning and Fountain, but Morning Thief will start after Fountain and Morning have already started. So it's the third geyser to start in the sequence when there's a trifecta. With fountain intervals and the stall timeline being stretched out in 2024, there were some times when it had been long enough since the last eruption that morning did start to boil, but it never followed through with any type of attempt at an eruption. And the only documented time I know of when stalls and morning occurred around the same time was this September of 2024 when there was a trifecta and a duel, and then in the week following that, there were some stalls. But the stalls kind of indicated that morning was not going to follow up. So I would say overall, morning is a bad sign, or morning's thief, and being high during stalls is a bad sign for any chance for morning. But I'm just going to throw this trifecta picture in because it's pretty. So I know I'm going long here. Bear with me. I have some updates to share, and this is with great thanks to Corbin Cooper, who helped me understand what was going on in the winter of 2025. This is kind of our record scratch moment because I just told you that Morning Thief didn't change very much with stalls. But that has turned out to be yet another thing that can change about the group. So the activity that was observed during December and January was pretty well in keeping with what we had seen in October before the park closed. Graham saw a stall that was similar to what we had seen before on January 9th. Clepsydra was having normal pauses, came on steady, no fountain as of 2 hours and 45 minutes after Clepsydra came on steady. So the first major changes were noted on February 7 by one of the tour guides, Amy Troutman. And thank you, Amy, for posting the videos to Facebook because kind of blew my mind. We were seeing something quite different happening at the Fountain Group during a stall. And this what follows is based on reports from guides and rangers and what Corbin shared with me, and also thank you, Brandon Crows, for the video. Seeing this winter is that Clepsydra is on weekly. It doesn't fit exactly with the short pause mode or the weak sloppy mode or the long pause mode or the front vent stall type. So this is something new. It's on weekly. While this is happening, the side vent is splashing 1 to 2 feet above the rim from a low water level. Fountain and morning water levels are very, very high, even higher than what I showed you before, probably halfway up the oval. So a pool starting to form between Fountain and Morning. Morning Thief has been constantly boiling and overflowing, with the height varying from 1 to 2 feet to surges to 8 to 10 feet, like that video showed. During some of the stalls, the eruptions of jelly have been stronger, like the video I showed you. We're getting shorter fountain durations, a lot of them 20 minutes, and then Corbin saw one that was only 17 minutes 55 seconds. And the fountain intervals were harder to pin down because it's winter. It's difficult to get a closed interval, but the short end appeared to be 3.5 to 5.5 hours. The longer ones, there were none that I could confirm that were closed, so it's hard to know what's happening with the long intervals. And then a couple of other notes on February 25th, Fountain started while water levels were high and Morning Seaf was boiling and overflowing on an interval of approximately 3.5 hours. So this would sort of fit into the category of an aborted stall, but Morning Seaf just kept on boiling through the eruption. So it's definitely doesn't fit any of the previous types that we know of. And then on February 28th, Fountain started dropping with no known trigger. So ordinarily, Fountain would start dropping when clepsydra came on steady. But on the 28th of February, there was nothing that happened in the group that seemed to trigger the drop. It dropped down over a period of 90 minutes from covering the lower part of the oval to just barely covering the rocks. So that's relatively fast drop, but not with clepsydra coming on steady. So maybe something else that we find happening later will help us understand what makes Fountain drop, but it wasn't obvious to Corbin. So I have gone long enough. I want to thank again Graham and Lynn and Corbin, and also Micah Kipple, Craig Munson, Brandon Crows. I missed Pat Snyder in this list. I'm so sorry. She made that beautiful thumbnail slide for me. And of course, all the rangers and guides and everyone who contributed to Geyser Times. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Tara. And if any of you guys have questions, feel free to put them into the chat and we'll go through at least a few of them. Okay, a question from Corbin here. In your observations, how have stalls been distributed during sorry. In your observations, how have stalls been distributed during individual years? Do they tend to be clustered or more evenly spread out?
That's a good question, which I'm not sure any of my slides specifically addressed. Um, so they will sometimes happen in clusters, and some years it'll be more common than others. They were more spread out in 2021, kind of more clustered in 2022, and really, yeah, 22, 23, and 24. Maddeningly frequent, they can happen back to back. So there really isn't any normal distribution, and also it would be hard for us to tell because of all the data that gets missed overnight or when people are watching other things.
Another question here. Do you think these extended pauses of clepsydra would be an attempt at a returning to pre-earthquake mode?
The longer this goes on, the more I have suspected that could be the case, because for starters, the pause mode seems to be gradually stretching how long it will go. So at first it was only 25 pauses of clepsydra in 2021. Then it was 30. Then it's 51. Then it's 61. So is there going to be a point when it just begins more of what it was doing long before the earthquake, when we have records that it was the like clockwork frequent geyser? that gave it its name. Um, but anything past that is definitely speculation. Um, one thing I'll point out too is that with these stalls, you're getting fountain less, just way less often overall. You get so many more of these long intervals. So it has taken its toll on fountain. Fountain is still definitely the dominant member. It still erupts on a daily basis most of the time. But sometimes in a calendar day, if you had two really long stalls, you might get one or only two eruptions of fountain. So I think that shows Fountain in a bit of a decline as well, at least for the current behavior.
Okay. Just as a reminder, if you got any questions, drop them into the chat. And Micah, during the chain of geysers described by Marler in the 40s and 50s, was there any notable activity from other players, Spasm Jelly, etc., or did they appear to participate like they do today?
I am going to refer you to the Marler inventory for that because this was already a huge topic and I didn't really research the rest of that uh, behavior outside of the main connection that Marler described between Morning, Clepsydra, and Fountain. So I apologize, but I can't answer that one.
Okay, and another one here. Have you ever wondered what might happen if a stall went on long enough to get Fountain or Morning to go into overflow?
That is a great question. No, I guess I hadn't really gone there. I should have, though. There are pictures from various times in history showing both Fountain and Morning overflowing. Fountain actually, when it was dormant, it was developing that white scalloped edge that Micah talked about. The pictures that were taken by Ansel Adams when he came to Yellowstone show that situation of Fountain and Morning both, you know, their pools are both completely full and overflowing, and then there's a pool in between them. So I guess that is one of the possibilities. If the stall were to continue on, you might be sitting there one day and it just keeps getting higher and higher until it starts overflowing. I don't like our chances for more activity from either Fountain or Morning, however, in that event, but it would be interesting.
Okay.
Alrighty, thank you.
Okay. So up and right before I was about ready to call it there. One more. How long do you normally have to stay after Fountain to know if it is going to go into a stall?
That is a great question that I should have had on a slide, but I didn't. Great question. So the pause sequence afterwards will start somewhere, usually 14, 15 minutes after the end of Fountain. It could be as much as 30 minutes after the end of Fountain. And then you wait to see how many pauses there will be. So, usually, to be confident that it's not a stall, that Clepsydra has come back on steady, it could be as short as about a half hour after Fountain, or it could be as long as an hour. If you get a long delay between the end of Fountain and the first pause, and then several pauses, it could be as much as an hour before Clepsydra goes on steady after that. So it is quite a time investment, especially if you already spent 2 hours waiting for, or 3 hours waiting for Fountain. And that's one of the reasons I don't have a lot of personal data on this because my life is built around schedules and I have to be places. But I'm very thankful once again to the people who have documented this behavior over the last few years and gotten some really solid information about the long pause mode.
Okay, and I think with that, we will go ahead and wrap that up for tonight. And next week, we will have our final presentation of our 2025 series about the 2024 activity of Opal Pool, and that is going to be presented by Ben Vanderlei at same time at 7 p.m. Mountain on next Tuesday. And with that, thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you next week.